The NBA as of late has been absolutely flooded with talent. In the crossroads era of having stars like Kawhi, Kevin Durant, LeBron, and so on playing past their prime into their later years while continuing to build on their already established legacies, while also having younger players like Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, SGA, and that class of future stars that are currently looking to create similar legacies to the stars they grew up watching and now playing against. But something that has pretty much consistently remained the same through both eras is the fact of the Western Conference continually being the deeper conference. Not to say that the Western Conference is always necessarily the better conference, but for a few reasons we'll explain during the second half of the video, it does seem that more talent is often pulled to the West Coast. For example, just look at this year's playoff matchups. There has been some conversation around the difference in finals runs between the Celtics and the Mavericks, with the Mavs first having to go up against a Paul George and James Harden-led Clippers team with Kawhi suiting up for 2 games and Russ coming off the bench, compared to the Celtics going up against a Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero-led Heat team with Jimmy Butler not playing a single game and DeLon Wright coming off the bench. Even looking at the rest of the teams who ended up in the playoffs, and the difference in talent between the two conferences. Teams like the Timberwolves, Thunder, and Nuggets in the West proved how much deeper of a team they were, with all of those teams having contributing efforts from the entire team and having essential points coming from their bench players. Now compare that to the East. After Giannis and Dame were injured, it was pretty much an easy walk for the Pacers to get them done. Joel Embiid being a little hobbled definitely made it easier for the Knicks to get the Sixers done, and even looking at the Knicks run, it's clear that they just weren't as deep of a team, with Tibbs heavily relying on his starting players having them average a combined 41 minutes a game, the highest for any teams in the playoffs this year. Obviously that is partially due to Tibbs being a straight up tyrant, but really there is only so much production you can rely on when you have Alec Burks and Precious Achiuwa coming off the bench. And as I mentioned, this isn't something new, as even throughout the 2010s, the West was just a deeper conference. The easiest way of showing that is by simply just looking at the past NBA champs since 2010, to which the Western Conference leads with 9 rings and the Eastern Conference has 6. But obviously just looking at who the NBA champ was for a specific year does not tell the entire story for that season. As years like 2016, where you have the Cavs who pulled out an incredible 3-1 comeback and winning the Larry O'Brien that year. But some teams like the 67-15 Spurs and the peak KD Westbrook OKC team may get forgotten. And those teams made it an absolute battle zone in the West. Not taking anything away from the unreal feat that LeBron, Kyrie, and the Cavs pulled out by making that comeback, as no matter what happened in the West, I think LeBron would have willed his team to the championship by any means necessary. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Warriors continually had the harder path to get to the finals than LeBron in the East, who often had second seeds that would have been about 5th or 6th seeds if their records were in the West. Again, not to downplay that 2016 championship by any means, but I think it's pretty telling that it took LeBron moving to the West and Kawhi Leonard coming to the East for someone to finally put a stop to Golden State's reign and have someone not named LeBron James win a championship for the Eastern Conference in an entire decade. Of course, Kawhi immediately fled back to the Western Conference the next year, and so did the Larry O'Brien. And that right there is kind of part of the problem, as some teams in the East like the Toronto Raptors have a hard time keeping high-level talent, and eventually slowly splinter off their pieces once their value starts to grow. Just think of a lot of the recent dynasty teams since the 2000s. The Steph-led Warriors, the Tim Duncan-led Spurs, and the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. All Western Conference teams. And sure, if you listen to Celtic fans, they'd convince you that they currently have the only dynasty team that matters, but after winning one championship, it is way too early to be throwing that phrase around. But beyond that, there is also just overall pretty poor managing in the East, as it almost feels like there's a list of like 7 teams in the East that solely exist for the purpose of holding on to semi-talented players before shipping them to the West for pennies on the dollar. Just look at the recent Hawks and Pelicans trade, as well as the Giddey for Caruso trade. Strictly basketball-wise, I do still think Giddey has some potential, and getting a new team will help bring him back to how he was playing before last season and the incident. But considering that Giddey's value was at an all-time low and Caruso's value was at an all-time high, the Bulls could have at least tried to squeeze one first-round pick out of them. And for the Hawks, how do you look at the Knicks-Nets trade for Mikal Bridges that just got the Nets 5 first-round picks, and decide the value for DeJounte Murray is around 1 Larry Nance, a Dyson Daniels, and 2 first-round picks? Poor management decisions like those, as well as others coming from teams like the Wizards, who looked at this year's draft, a draft that analysts and scouts have been calling the worst draft in years, and decided that now was the time to load up on picks for the draft. And going hand in hand with the poor front office decisions is just the sheer talent amongst head coaches in the West. Having legend Greg Popovich, also Steve Kerr, and a growing genius in Mark Daigneault, compared to the East, who has Monty Williams getting paid $65 million to sit at home. As well as the Milwaukee Bucks, who I'm pretty sure at this point have about 4 head coaches on their payroll still. And one of them is Doc Rivers, who for some reason keeps finding employment in the East, which really is all the proof that you need that Eastern teams just overall are more poorly run.
While the East has a number of dumpster fire teams, the West has a bunch of teams that, despite the odds, are the opposite. There's a number of really well-run teams that consistently show back up in and around the playoffs. Examples of this include the Utah Jazz, who are a small market team prone to the same problems as the other ones, yet is famed NBA-wide for its ability to be competitive, with rosters considered sketchy at best on paper, especially in recent years. They have missed the playoffs for the last 2 years, but for the vast majority of the Jazz's history, they've been pretty competitive, generally making the playoffs and even having some deep runs at that. Another team that isn't in the largest market by any means, yet is renowned for development and consistent success, are the San Antonio Spurs. Before this year, this team had probably been at its lowest point ever for the past 5 years. During this time, they were a bit directionless, not making the playoffs any of those years, or even really being that competitive. Before these recent years though, the Spurs might actually be one of the most successful franchises in the entire NBA for how long it's been around. They've had a bunch of homegrown and well-developed championship-winning teams from era to era, all headed by some all-time players like David Robinson and Tim Duncan. Despite the recent speed bump, the Spurs rarely had seasons where they weren't competitive ever since their start in the NBA. It's now once again looking like the Spurs could be in for a great decade or so with generational talent Victor Wembanyama at the helm. So expect to see the Spurs name around a lot in the upcoming years. The last quick example we'll talk about here is the Oklahoma City Thunder. Despite being a relatively new franchise, they've been through multiple eras of having very competitive teams already. They've proven that despite the roadblocks like stars leaving, the Thunder is one of the most competent organizations in the entire NBA at pretty much everything. They aren't afraid to make a trade, have good development, and pretty good success in the draft. They've even assembled a young team in the current era that looks like it'll be around for a while. The West has some truly great teams that defy the odds, but what if I told you that the reasons outside of basketball to go to the West might even be a bigger deal than the reasons inside basketball? NBA players are human beings after all. Despite being professional basketball players, they still spend most of their time living their own life outside of basketball. And let me tell you, there are more than a few reasons to live in the western half of the country as a young man with way more money than he knows what to do with. The pluses to living in a lot of these western cities quickly add up and no doubt contributes to players staying with their teams as well as free agent signings. We'll have to break this down region by region though, because the West has multiple draws to it. Of course, the most obvious draw to the West is California itself. Despite having some of the highest taxes in the country, free agents have been known to flock to teams located in California. We have the Lakers and Clippers in Los Angeles, which are definitely the most attractive destinations in the entire league. Los Angeles has anything you could ever want in the entire world if you're a rich person. It has some of the best weather in the world, a bunch of other rich people to hang out with, anything you could ever want to buy. The list just keeps going on. Not only this, but if you're looking to build a brand, there is nowhere better to be in the entire world, given that the entertainment industry is what the city is known for. Superstars in particular are drawn to the teams in this city because of a mixture of both reasons mentioned. Bench players, they might just go for the weather and vibes. It's LA after all. Another city in California that's pretty nice to live in if you're rich is San Francisco, home of the Golden State Warriors. This city definitely doesn't have the draw of Los Angeles for NBA players, but it's not too bad itself either for weather, culture, and exposure. Luckily, if you want the best of the best, it's just a quick plane ride away from LA, and with NBA money that's basically like taking a taxi. Something that San Francisco has going for it besides proximity to LA is investment opportunity. It's the home of Silicon Valley and is known for being ripe with startups that an NBA player can easily try to invest in. These reasons likely contributed to a lot of the players from the Curry era staying with the Golden State Warriors as it built up. We'll also give a quick shout out to Sacramento for being a good city, but it's definitely a smaller market and isn't as coveted as a destination as the other 3 Californian teams. So overall, California ticks about every box for a young rich athlete besides the tax situation, but if you're a bench player who would like to save on some of those taxes, there's a state with 3 NBA teams that has you covered: Texas. This state is home to the San Antonio Spurs, Dallas Mavericks, and Houston Rockets. The biggest draw of this state is that there's actually no income tax, which is obviously pretty appealing to players making millions. Why play in cold Toronto and get taxed half of your income for home games when you could play in warm Texas and keep a lot more money? In addition to low taxes, you can buy a pretty huge mansion in Texas for not that much more compared to a box in the sky in Toronto or New York, even if it may be luxurious. NBA players with large families may heavily weigh playing for a Texas team simply due to saving money through taxes and having more living space for their families without breaking the bank. So right there we already have 7 teams in 2 states that are very attractive destinations for different reasons. The rest of the West may not be as attractive as these places, but they still have some pretty good reasons why an NBA player might want to play or stay there. Cities like New Orleans and Portland have some of the most vibrant cultures in America despite being on the smaller side. NBA money goes a long way in places like Oklahoma City or Salt Lake City, Utah, where you could buy a mansion for relatively cheap. So right there we have the vast majority of Western NBA cities with pretty huge draws for not only stars but people who ride the bench as well. When you compare a lot of these cities to the more congested and grimy east of the country, it's really a no-brainer why certain players might even take a few $1 million worth of a pay cut to play for one of the Western teams mentioned. Of course, the East has draws as well, like Florida having no income tax and great weather, Boston's legendary sporting culture, or the bright lights of New York City. Unfortunately for the East though, there just aren't as many reasons to play or stay there. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Charlotte, and some more just don't do it for a lot of NBA players. It's not exactly like the majority of these teams mentioned are an example of how to run a successful franchise in the East either. This raises the question, will the East ever get as deep as the West? Could NBA teams in the East attempt to get creative to sway NBA free agents to their cities? It's tough to tell, but it's definitely looking like for the next little bit, we're going to continue to see the Western Conference have a bit more depth than the East. Another quick thing to mention is that with the reported Las Vegas and Seattle teams being added to the league soon, we may be seeing a Western team close to the East be shifted. Prime candidates include Memphis, Minnesota, and New Orleans. It's not like the East is getting another team like the Lakers, but any one of these teams will easily be more exciting in the East than a lot of the teams that we just ragged on. Maybe that could help the East get to the level of the Western teams, but for now we can probably count on seeing the same old teams in the East duke it out in the playoffs as the West continues to be a battleground with an insane amount of attractive teams. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider commenting, liking, subscribing. Anything helps and we appreciate everything. And we'll see you next week.